Welcome everyone to the Unit 5 overview video, and I want to say congrats to all of you last week of this accelerated winter course, and I'm excited for everyone to cross the finish line. So the purpose of this video is to lay out what you can expect as far as work and this last sort of condensed week goes. In this unit, we'll be covering chapters 9 and 10. So let's get into it and first start out with how you can earn your engagement point for this particular unit. So for this one, I'd like for you to download a document called Course Evaluation within the Engagement submodule in Unit 5. Fill it out and upload it once completed. Just know that I'm grateful for your feedback in advance. I take it very seriously to make sure that this course and every other course in the grad program is as strong as it can be. And this class in particular is the first time that we are running it over a winter session. So any and all feedback is welcome, and thank you in advance. Here we can get into now a discussion on what you can expect when reading through chapters 9 and 10 in Unit 5. So these particular chapters cover two emerging areas in sport. The first being intellectual property, and this has to do with inventions, trademarks, and copyrighted material, including artistic creations, as well as the right to publicity. And the final chapter that you'll read is antitrust law. This has been, I would say, pretty prominently within the sports setting since the early 2010s. It's coming up now more and more often, especially with NCAA student athletes battle for compensation is something that we've discussed and read a little bit about in class. This chapter approaches it more broadly, so you can see some of those discussion points within there, but also how it has been historically used within sports settings, especially in relation to like broadcasting, team relocation, etc. So here is our plan for this week. First, your engagement number 5 is due on Wednesday, just a shift in due date there. Same with your Unit 5 chapter quizzes, that is also due on Wednesday. A quick note for the chapter quizzes, when you click submit on those this week, you will actually be able to see what you've gotten right or wrong immediately with feedback. The reason for that being I want us to be able to manage our time effectively as it is a shorter week, especially in preparation for the final exam. The other two remaining assignments, the career connection reflection video is due on Thursday, and the final exam must be completed by Friday at 11:59 p.m. You can find more information about the career connection reflection video in Unit 5. You'll see there the assignment portal where you can upload. The instructions and rubric is posted in the Start Here module on D2L. Reach out with any questions that you might have. One quick note for you, your engagement for last week in Unit 4 should help you start to think about potentially ways that you can answer the questions required within this video reflection. At the end of the video, I will share more about what you can expect in the final exam. We're going to move now into discussing and introducing some of the actual chapters in and of itself. So the first chapter that I'd like to discuss is chapter 9, and this relates back to intellectual property law. So learning objectives for us is just learning about all of the ways that this area of law applies to sports settings. You're going to read a lot about different types of trademarks, copyrights, patent law, etc., especially when any of those items is classified as trademark infringement, copyright infringement, etc. The final discussion point within this chapter relates to athletes' personal right to publicity. And so for us with this chapter, what I'm really hoping that we walk away with is that intellectual property law is something that's widely applicable within sport. I think it's probably more important now than ever concerning the ways in which athletes at the college level have ownership over their name, image, and likeness and are fighting for increased compensation, especially within this area, to be able to profit off of what they have rightfully claimed as their own commercial interest. Let's talk about some key concepts here to prepare you for what you can expect. One of the first things that you'll read about is the Trademark Act of 1946. This is the Lanham Act. This particular law governs the law of trademarks and their registration and provides a course of action that protect trademark rights from being infringed. Really, the whole point of this law is to protect the owner of a trademark by preventing others from using that mark without their permission or in a way that causes confusion. So the trademark in and of itself, let's talk about this. You've likely seen some type of logo or image with a little TM on the bottom of it. That is representative of a trademark. A trademark identifies a seller's goods and distinguishes them from those that are being sold by others. It also indicates that products are of a certain quality. It advertises, promotes, and assists in selling those goods. It signifies that the goods come from a particular source, etc. So really what the purpose of a trademark is all of those sort of encompassed in one. It's identifying, who the seller is, their goods, the quality of those goods, and distinguishes it from what is being sold by another group, seller, etc. Great example for this in sports settings. I bet that you can see as whether you identify as a UNC, a Duke fan, or maybe even neither one of those. I would bet that you could guess that a UNC fan knows that they are come from a different group than a Duke fan. They might even argue that they are a different quality than a Duke fan, and vice versa. But this is one example of an identifiable source, right, that is distinguishable from one another. Here's another example here that signifies the importance of why trademarks are critical because it demonstrates that goods come from one source. So, just a few years ago, the University of Akron had a number of logos. They were the Zips, and their logo is some type of kangaroo, is what it looks like here up on the screen. So you can see that there are 8 different trademarked logos that the University of Akron used to have to brand their athletics department. So, as you can imagine, going out wearing different gear, whether you are a staff member or a student athlete, you are wearing one of these 8 logos. And while the color scheme is the same, right, there was some potentially some kind of confusion and not a lot of consistency in branding. And that's something that the new athletic director wanted to turn around just a few years ago. And so this is one example of how they have rebranded their institution. They kept the same color scheme, but wanted to make sure that the logo was identifiable and signified that everything came from one source as opposed to 8 different logos. In this chapter, you'll also read about multiple different types of trademarks. I've listed them here on the screen as they exist on a spectrum that ranges from not distinct with limited or zero protection to the most distinct, most distinguishable between goods and services. And these ones receive the highest form of protection. So, in general, the more distinctive that a trademark is, the more protection that they have. So, I'm going to share some here with you. Now, arbitrary or fanciful marks, these are strong trademarks that are typically creative or unique and that set you apart from your competitors. So, one example here that we can think about this is probably with the Apple logo. We know that Apple obviously has a really strong brand identity and brand equity. And this is a logo that is creative, unique, and sets them apart from other competitors, Microsoft, IBM, etc. If we continue to move down the scale to now the middle point here, and we have suggestive marks in the middle, these marks can hint at characteristics of goods or services, but they do require some imagination to understand the product that they represent. A good example of this is actually Netflix. So, if we break down what Netflix actually means, is you are watching flicks on the net, right? And that's really where the particular name and trademark comes from. Continuing to move down the spectrum, now we have descriptive marks. These merely describe some aspect of a good or service without identifying or distinguishing the source of those goods or services. So, one example of that would be American Airlines. It's an airline in the US. Another example related to sport would be Louisville Slugger, right? Slugger relates back to baseball. This is representative of the good or service that comes from a baseball bat. So, this is kind of describing what that is. And then finally, at the bottom end of the spectrum here, we have generic marks. These trademarks, excuse me, or marks are so common that they clearly don't indicate the source of a good or service. And really what happens here is some companies have created unique and distinct names that eventually they lose their trademark rights because their name or their logo becomes so well known. So a great example of this is Kleenex. Maybe at some point in your life you've heard somebody refer to a tissue as a Kleenex, right? And we know that Kleenex just produces tissues, but it has become in some ways synonymous with tissues. Other examples of this would be Xerox, making copies, etc. So now we've discussed a little bit about what trademarks are, as well as the Lanham Act. The final concept that I want to relate back here in relation to trademarks would be a trademark infringement. And this is defined as when someone who is not a trademark owner engages in an unauthorized use of a trademark that's likely to cause consumers to be confused or deceived about who really owns the trademark. You'll read about the various factors that determine if infringement has occurred, as well as the defense to infringement claims. I want to share one example with you that's listed up here on the screen. So, if you follow any type of basketball, or you are a Chicago Bulls fan, or you are just a sports memorabilia merch fan, you probably recognize the logo on the bottom right of your screen to the far right, Air Jordan. Now, the logo immediately to the left of this was proposed by Gronk, who was a former tight end for the New England Patriots when he was creating his own sort of apparel line. Now, this was filed as a trademark infringement claim because it is similar in terms of its structure and display to the Air Jordan trademark. Now, granted, this was representative of a Gronk spike within this logo, but as you can see when they're side by side, especially, they do look very similar to one another. And the argument there is that this generated consumer confusion. Finally, to wrap up our discussion on Chapter 9, here are just a few other key concepts that will be discussed throughout the chapter: licensing for apparel and merchandise, as well as the concept of cyber squatting; copyright law, which is a right granted by statute to an author or creator of a literary or artistic work that provides authors with exclusive rights to distribution and reproduction of the production itself; patent law. This protects inventions. It's most applicable to equipment and the game itself. Fun fact, the Arena Football League owns a patent for that style of football. And finally, the right to publicity. This is, as I mentioned before, most applicable now with the advent of name, image, and likeness rights since July 1st, 2021. To conclude our chapter overview, we're now going to discuss Chapter 10, which covers antitrust law. This chapter, as a full disclosure, would be a complete law class that we would spend a lot of time discussing. Antitrust law can be very dense and philosophical because it weaves together economic as well as like commerce and trade intersections with the law. So, really, I encourage you when you read through this chapter to consider this from a sport perspective. Look at the different federal antitrust laws, the way that they apply to sport. Examine the different types of exemptions from antitrust law that apply to professional sport, and enjoy learning about the history of team movement and see how antitrust laws affect that within sport. You'll see here, as I've screenshotted on the screen, that this is something that's highly relevant in today's world. I actually took this from December 2025, a news release bringing up Michael Jordan again here, that NASCAR settled an antitrust case with Michael Jordan and other plaintiffs. If you're curious, you can Google and read more about this. When I think about antitrust law, the number one thing that I think about is monopoly. Now, I hope that you've played Monopoly at some point in your life. Full disclosure, this is a board game that is actually banned in my family household. We are not permitted to play it anymore, probably because my brother and I strategized really heavily in Monopoly to corner a market. And I'm sure that when you're thinking about this and how you've played my Monopoly, that you're thinking, what was your strategy? Or what was a strategy that you saw other players come up with? Now, a monopoly in this game is the same thing as a monopoly in real life. We can define it as an organization that possesses exclusive control over the means of selling or producing a product. It's very similar to the actual board game in and of itself. You were trying to corner a market, buy different properties, as many as you could, to be able to bankrupt the other players. Now, they want that power, right, to be able to impoverish their rivals in the game. Maybe that seems a little harsh. That's how my brother and I approached it, hence why it's banned in our family. But really, this is the same thing that happens in real life, and why antitrust law exists. Because companies and organizations, even a sport league, can corner a market and they desire to accumulate such a degree of power that they control all of the means of selling or producing a product. So, at its core, we can think of antitrust law as the intersection of the law and of economics. As I mentioned before, do not get bogged down in the economic terms or the nitty-gritty details of antitrust law. At a very broad level, what I want us to walk away with is that this particular type of law has a profound impact on sport in and of itself. It will have an increasing effect on college sport, especially with rulings like O'Bannon versus NCAA and Alston versus NCAA. Its purposes are to promote competition and efficiency in the marketplace, to protect consumers from the growing monopoly power of big business, and to maintain a high level of competition among producers so that consumers can obtain quality products at reasonable prices. An important note here: antitrust laws may result in consumers getting products at reasonably affordable prices, but it is not a stated purpose of the law. This chapter focuses primarily on federal antitrust law. Each state has an antitrust law that mirrors the federal law. Some examples of the laws that you'll read about are the Sherman Antitrust Act, the Clayton Antitrust Act, Curt Flood Act, Sports Broadcasting Act. There are a number of sections within the Sherman Antitrust Act. Section 1 is probably the one that's most applicable to sport, and this holds illegal any contract, trust, or conspiracy in the restraint of trade in interstate commerce. I've included the actual language from the law in and of itself here on the screen, and that bolded area is representative of what I just shared. So again, to reiterate, it holds illegal any contract, trust, or conspiracy in restraint of trade in interstate commerce. So, really, what this is looking at is any actions of two or more individuals or entities that limit competition. Restraint of trade would be representative of that activity that limits a party's ability to enter some type of transaction. And interstate commerce would be commerce that takes place between two or more states. And now, with the advent of online sales, this is highly relevant, and certainly very relevant within sports as it involves interstate commerce for competitions or even the sale of different merchandise, etc. So there are two ways that the court will analyze conduct that could violate Section 1 of the Sherman Antitrust Act. The first way is called the per se rule. This looks at inherently anti-competitive conduct, such as price fixing and group boycotts, which you'll read about. The second way that the court will analyze conduct is using the rule of reason. This applies when conduct is not inherently anti-competitive and examines if conduct restrains trade unreasonably. Section 2 of the Sherman Act prohibits behaviors related to monopolization. And here, as you're reading on the screen, the direct language from the law itself, I've bolded monopolize multiple times so that you know that this particular section prohibits behaviors related to monopolization. Now, important note, having a monopoly itself isn't illegal. If one company has a strong market share due to fair competition, superior products, or innovation, that's okay. What is not permitted is that if a monopoly is achieved through predatory pricing, anti-competitive behaviors, or exclusionary practices that negatively impact consumers, this is when it becomes illegal. What happens if there's a breach of the Sherman Act, Sections 1 or Section 2? This is where something called the Clayton Antitrust Act comes into play. And you will read in the textbook how the NFL team, the Raiders owner Al Davis, pursued this in the 1980s. Final portion of this video, I'm just going to briefly describe what you can expect for the final exam. So as far as format goes, there are 34 questions total for 100 points. There's 15 for matching, true, false, multiple choice, multi-select, and then a brief application essay. When it comes to topics, this is a cumulative final exam. So please expect to have questions pertaining to each chapter and unit from the course. I've included a study guide posted within the Unit 5 module that you can review and begin to fill out in preparation for the exam. Just some notes related to instructions. There is one attempt allowed. It will be timed at 2 hours. I strongly recommend that you do not start it until you are ready to take it and can take it with no distractions. If you encounter any issues, email me immediately. When you click submit on the exam, make sure that the submission screen pops up. Grades will not be automatically shown to you as I have to go in and manually grade them with the essay. And you will be able to get all feedback from me, including reviewing the questions and answers once the due date passes. If you have any questions for me in relation to Unit 5, the final exam, etc., please feel free to reach out. I hope that you all have a great week and a strong end as we cross over the finish line to wrap up WSSD 605. Have a good one.